So, today we're going to jump into the messages of three Old Testament prophets you might not think about too often: Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now, their world was, completely different from ours. But the problems they were dealing with, man, they feel incredibly relevant. We're talking about misplaced priorities, a lost sense of identity, and just plain spiritual burnout. These are challenges we still face today, for sure. So let's see what these ancient voices have to teach us.
I want to kick things off with a question we are still debating. Does the actual physical place where people worship really matter? From these huge grand cathedrals to a simple little storefront church, does the building itself have any real connection to the faith of the people inside?
We've all heard this, right? It's a really common idea. And honestly, it's often used to just dismiss the importance of religious buildings altogether. We might say something like, "Oh, I prefer the cathedral of the outdoors," or maybe quote a verse about how God doesn't live in temples made by hands. And usually the conversation just stops there.
Except it doesn't really stop there. Because then you run into this prophet, Haggai. And his entire message, his whole reason for being, is a direct challenge to that very idea. He just completely complicates things and forces us to rethink that connection between our physical world and our spiritual lives.
Okay, so to really get these prophets, we have to go back in time to post-exilic Judah. The people have finally returned from their exile in Babylon, which is great, but their city and, most importantly, their temple are in absolute ruins. And look, this wasn't just a construction project they needed to deal with. This was a deep, fundamental crisis for the whole society. It was hitting their priorities, their very identity, and their connection to God.
So first up is Haggai. Let's call him the prophet of pragmatism. On the surface, his job doesn't sound very, spiritual. He was basically sent on a 3.5-month mission with one single, very practical goal: get the people to stop working on their own fancy paneled houses and finally start rebuilding God's temple. And right here, you can see the central conflict. On one side, you've got the community, totally wrapped up in their own comfort, their own projects. And then on the other side, Haggai's call is this jarring interruption. It's forcing them to look up from their own stuff and recenter their priorities around their shared commitment to God. And this brings us to a really crucial idea, what we could call grounded spirituality. What Haggai is teaching is that we're not just disembodied spirits floating around. We live in a real material world. And sometimes an act of faith and obedience looks a lot like picking up bricks and mortar. Repairing a building can be just as much an act of worship as singing inside it, because it literally grounds our big, extraordinary beliefs in tangible, real-world action. So at the exact same time that Haggai was working on rebuilding the physical foundation of the temple, his partner in prophecy, Zechariah, was tackling a different kind of ruin, the ruined foundation of the people's identity. He was the visionary storyteller. See, it wasn't just the temple that was a pile of rubble. The people's sense of self was too. I mean, for a century, they had been kicked around, mocked, and abused by one world power after another. This was a people with a history full of giants like Abraham and David, and now they were in real danger of completely forgetting who they were.
Zechariah's approach? It was totally different from Haggai's get-to-work commands. He didn't order people around. Instead, he shared these powerful and frankly pretty bizarre visions. But they weren't just weird dreams. They were carefully crafted images of a God who was still in control. And they were designed to seep into the people's imagination and fight back against that story of shame and ridicule they'd been telling themselves.
And you know what? The effect was absolutely transformative. By re-energizing their imaginations, Zechariah helped the people recover the magnificence of their own story. He gave them a whole new vocabulary to understand what God was doing in their lives, and it allowed them to see themselves not as victims, but once again, as God's chosen people.
Because of this, his impact lasts way beyond his own time. You can think of Zechariah's visions as these little time capsules. They provide a language for faith and purpose that people can open up centuries later, and they still release incredible insight and hope, especially for anyone who feels lost in the big, overwhelming stories of the modern world.
All right. So, the temple is being rebuilt. The people are starting to remember who they are. Things are getting back to normal. And that, right there, that moment of normalcy, is exactly where our third prophet Malachi shows up. He's the provocative agitator, and his message isn't for a time of crisis, it's for a time of comfort. I mean, think about it. When you're in a crisis, God is front-page news in your life. Every little decision feels massively significant. But what about during those normal, humdrum, day-to-day times?
Well, we get preoccupied with ourselves, don't we? And our interest in God gets pushed to the margins. Religion can become kind of trivial, more of a hobby than a core part of who we are.
So Malachi's job is basically to be a divine wake-up call. He shows up and creates a crisis of conscience when we don't even realize there's a problem. He confronts our complacency and wakes us up to what you could call the crisis of God, that state of just ignoring God in our daily lives. His goal is to keep us alert and ready to respond to God's presence.
So here's the really cool part. When you put these three prophets together, you don't just get three separate, disconnected messages. What you actually get is a coherent, timeless spiritual blueprint for what a healthy community really needs to not just survive, but to thrive.
And this is how it all comes together in one complete blueprint. First, you have Haggai, who grounds our beliefs in real-world action to fix our messed-up priorities. Then comes Zechariah, who helps us reimagine our story to restore our lost identity. And finally, Malachi steps in to confront our spiritual apathy and shake us out of a dangerous comfort. It's this perfect trio: action, identity, and alertness. You really need all three.
And it's Malachi who actually gets the very last word of the Old Testament. He leaves us with these two gigantic figures, Moses and Elijah. And the symbolism is just beautiful. Moses keeps us rooted in the past, remembering everything God has done. But Elijah keeps us alert and looking to the future, watching for what God will do. It's this powerful call to live right in that balance between memory and hope.
So that brings us to one last question, and this one's for you to think about. When you look at the world around you, at our communities, at maybe even your own life, which of these prophetic voices do you think we need to hear most urgently right now? Is it Haggai's practical call to get to work, Zechariah's visionary storytelling, or Malachi's provocative wake-up call? Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining me for this.